Good morning. As you're logging in, we have a lot of attendees this morning, so bear with us for another moment. I'll just allow people to log in and then we'll make a start. Good morning, you're very welcome. We have a lot of attendees this morning, so we are just going to allow another moment or two just to make sure everybody gets logged in before we make a start. Good morning. You're all very, very welcome this morning. We've got a very important, I think a very timely webinar for you this morning from two of our patrons, Mills Selig and FPM, who've combined forces to take us through this morning about some proactive thinking we can do in these difficult times. We've entitled it How to Recession-Proof Your Business. We're all aware of the very difficult business environment we're operating in at the moment. And the purpose of this webinar is not to depress us any further. It's actually to be proactive and think about some logical steps you could take in your businesses. We're on Zoom this morning. You're probably all very familiar with Zoom by this stage. We are recording the session as well, and that's so that you can share it with colleagues and people who couldn't make it can catch up again on the CEF YouTube channel. Our agenda this morning, we think will take about 40-45 minutes. I'll be introducing you to the panel. We'll then be taking you through some of the trends and observations about what's going on in the economy and the construction sector this morning. Looking at some practical solutions about recovery and then the legal considerations of those, concluding with some questions and answers. Would ask you to use the Q&A function. That's at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A bubble. And if you submit any questions during the webinar this morning, I will pick those up at the end and share those questions on your behalf with the panel. We have a terrific panel this morning. You're not getting one, you're not getting two, you are getting three partners from two of the leading businesses in Northern Ireland this morning. As I say, patrons, FPM, we welcome this morning Gary Digney, who's partner for Restructuring Recovery in Ireland, licensed insolvency practitioner, and Gary's done some fairly groundbreaking work and has gathered some notes for some of the innovative solutions to debt management. Seamas Keating heads up Northern Ireland in terms of restructuring and recovery, and Seamas has worked specifically on a number of CVAs in construction sectors. So you're in very good hands this morning with FPM's team. And then also this morning we have joining us from Mills Selig, our legal patrons, Richard Craig, who's partner and heads up Restructuring Insolvency there. And Richard will be taking us through this morning some of the legal aspects to do with the various options and practical solutions that may be ahead. So as I say, you're in very good hands, three partners from two of the leading teams on the island. With no further ado, I'll hand over firstly to Gary, who's going to take you through the first section of the webinar. Gary, very welcome this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Mark, many thanks for the warm welcome, and a very warm welcome to all the attendees at this morning's webinar. There's much more exciting speakers coming up than me, so I'm going to dive straight into the slides. So, what is the market conditions like out there, folks? What is going on in the current marketplace? Is there Armageddon coming? Is the doom mongering through? Should we all stop listening to the news? Well, we certainly wouldn't subscribe to a lot of the harsh predictions that are out there. But in saying that, if you look at the trends, it does lead to the conclusion that there are significant headwinds ahead for businesses, and of course, in particular for the construction sector. So if we quickly go through a few of these, we have Brexit. Again, the full effects of Brexit probably hasn't been felt yet. We've got grace periods, the protocol, etc. So there's still uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty around Brexit. We then had a once in a lifetime global pandemic, and it's important that people remember there was a huge amount of HMRC debt parked. There was also a huge amount of COVID supports. A lot of new loans, CBILS loans, bounce back loans were taken onto the balance sheet of companies. And these are all now due for repayment. So that is exerting pressure on business. And then we have the macro issues. We have the Ukraine war, and we have the extraordinary inflation that is happening at the minute, significant energy costs, and of course now we are probably looking at significant interest rate rises. So I think it would be safe to conclude that pressure has never been greater on businesses than it currently is today. And if we go into this construction sector a wee bit further, of course, interest rate rises are a particular concern for the construction sector. Will it cause a slowdown in buyer confidence in the residential and commercial property? We then, in April 22, had the red diesel change, which of course had a very significant effect on a lot of construction businesses. We have the issues around fixed term contracts. I know Richard's maybe going to touch on something around contracts later on. We have supply chain pressures, labour shortages, and of course in Northern Ireland we do not have a functioning executive. And if there was a time we need an executive, it's now. So there is no doubt there are significant headwinds heading for all businesses, including the construction sector, over the next 12-24 months. So I suppose the aim of this webinar, folks, is to talk about these headwinds, to recognize the trends, to be alive and to implement strategies to alleviate any distress. When there's headwinds in the economy like this, distress will follow, and it's how you deal with the distress will ultimately dictate the future of your businesses. So the key, we always like to put this slide up to demonstrate the options that are available. And the key to any business in distress is early advice is sought. The earlier the advice is sought, the more options that are available. And if you have a wee look at this graph, if you look at the left-hand side of the graph towards the pleasure, the options are more informal in nature. You know, there's refinancing, and refinancing is always an option if it's the right refinance. Perhaps the business just needs some performance improvement, some turnaround advice, maybe an informal arrangement with creditors. And the key to all these options is early advice. As time goes on, the pressure increases, and then you're into more formal solutions, which Seamas and Richard will talk about, such as administration, you know, IVA is maybe a closure of a part of the business. And finally, at the end of the graph, you're in closure, which is liquidations and bankruptcies. So the key is speed and early advice, early advice, early advice. And also a point that's worth highlighting is the correct advice. You know, in my view, if a business or an individual is in distress, they should seek advice from either qualified insolvency practitioners or qualified insolvency lawyers, such as Richard, who'll be speaking later on. And the reason why that is very straightforward. Only qualified insolvency practitioners can offer the full suite of options that are on this spectrum. And unfortunately, in times of recession, a lot of insolvency advisors come into the marketplace, or pre-insolvency advisors. And the reality is, if you aren't provided with all the options, the likelihood is you may end up taking an option that isn't right for you or your business. And the wrong advice in this arena can be fatal. So it's just something to be alive to. So what are the options sorry, what are the warning signs, folks? What are the warning signs? And there is warning signs. There is always warning signs when a business is in distress, which will allow the directors or the owner to hopefully trigger a response which can alleviate whatever is causing the distress. So if you're sitting here listening to this now, maybe some of these points might come into your mind that you can use in the future. Is your bank overdraft maxed? Is it consistently rising? Are you seeing an increased number of bad debts? Are some of your customers taking longer to pay you? That's a big warning sign. Perhaps you're looking for an extension in your own creditor limits. Are you seeing any legal letters coming in from your creditors? Are your contracts loss making? Big problem in the current climate. Perhaps you're not paying a HMRC. Maybe you're stuck in a fixed price contract. And hopefully you aren't doing this, but we see it a lot. Maybe you're using personal funds to prop up the business. Are you struggling to pay wages? These are all warning signs that there is some level of distress in the business. And what we would say is, go and seek advice if that is the case. So what are the options? What are the options that are out there? And just before we go into the options, another piece of legislation change that has an effect on the options and also has an effect on lending is the restoration of the Crown preference. And not a lot of people really paid much attention to this because it came in, during the pandemic. But HMRC now, in terms of VAT and CIS deductions, in terms of PAYE, become preferential. So in any insolvency procedure, the revenue rank above the unsecured creditors, which is not good news for them. And they also rank above the floating charge holder, which is the bank. And many FDs or financial controllers on here would be comfortable with the term floating charge. That's what that's a charge the bank takes over the company. And really, when they lend money, and really what it does, it protects the bank in an insolvency procedure where the bank would get the majority of their money back. And if we just look at a very quick example here, pre-introduction of this Crown preference. In this example here, the bank at 80% return. In the post introduction of this Crown preference, that return reduced significantly. And vice versa for the revenue, we get a 10% return as opposed to 100 in post introduction of this. And what is the effect of that? Well, the effect of that in banking is because of the reduced value of that floating charge, the banks are now more risk adverse. They're now saying, well, we want maybe to enhance our security. So they're asking for additional assets to be secured on their debt. And they're asking for enhanced, maybe additional personal guarantees. They're really looking into the tax affairs of the company because the revenue now will get paid ahead of them if the worst happens and the business has to go into an insolvency procedure. So that has a real effect on funding. There's less funding available, and of course that is never good for business. And again, it's added more pressure on business. And it's also had an impact on the restructuring options. Seamas will go into the company voluntary arrangement, CVA, which was a very popular restructuring tool. It's something utilized widely. But because now the revenue effectively have to be paid in full, that may render that restructuring tool redundant. We'll have to see what the revenues attitude is going forward. So what are the options? We have informal options and we have formal options. And Seamas and Richard will speak about the formal options. Informal options, what are they? Well, informal restructuring I suppose the difference between the current situation and say the last financial crash is when the crash happened, there was no time. Banks called in loans, creditors winded up companies. There was no opportunity to do deals. And we feel, and maybe it's a symptom of the pandemic, we feel that creditors now are more open to perhaps an informal solution. And that's because they, if it's explained to them correctly, they realize that, you know, if a company goes into liquidation, they're likely to get very little. And with the Crown preference now becoming a preferential creditor, that chance of unsecured creditors getting paid has now been reduced. So informal restructuring is now on the pitch. It's something that we're actively involved in. And the key to it all is early advice. So examples of it are time to pay arrangements with the revenue. The revenue generally, if they're approached in the right way, will do a time to pay arrangement. Now, a caveat on that is when it goes so far in the revenue debt recovery process, there's no turning back. They won't enter into time to pay, and then you're into a formal insolvency procedure to address that revenue debt. And you've other things like cash flow. Cash flow, folks, historically, our poor cash flow management would have been the #1 driver for businesses going into insolvency. So in the current climate with the headwinds, both cost analysis and cash flow management is absolutely key. And there is advice to assist companies on that. It's absolutely key in the current climate. And then we have turnaround and consensual agreement with creditors, which is it's a process that takes time, but it is a process that can work if you've got the right advice and the right support. And informal deals can often be funded by refinancing, etc., where say your body of creditors opt to take a write-down. So these are the sort of informal options that are here, that are working. And what I would say is don't be afraid to seek advice on these options. So I'll just pass you on to Seamas now, who's going to speak about formal recovery options.
Gary, thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar. I'm going to look at the formal restructuring options and then some housekeeping from an accountancy point of view in the event that the company is addressing the unthinkable. Then Richard will bring you through some good legal considerations. So as Gary says, one of the key impacts on formal restructuring at the minute is the Crown preference and the fact that the Crown are higher up the distribution chain. And this is impacted very much on the acceptability of restructuring plans. Now, HMRC have published criteria on how they will consider a restructuring plan. And this published criteria says that they will consider restructuring plans, but that they are unable to accept restructuring plans that diminish their rights as a creditor. So they will not accept a restructuring plan that sees their preferential status reduced or sees them taking a lower return on their preferential debt in the event that other creditors such as suppliers and lenders are being paid when they are not due to be paid under normal protocol. This has meant that HMRC basically will not take a write down through a restructuring plan or want all the return. Now, that possibly has rendered proposals such as CVAs in great difficulty. So first of all, what is a CVA? A CVA is a formal insolvency process. So it is an insolvency event. The company is insolvent in an insolvency event. It's a legally binding court-approved agreement between a company and its creditors. So a company issues a proposal and the creditors are given the opportunity to consider it. Generally speaking, 75% of the creditors must accept the proposal who attend and vote at the meeting. The practicality of the CVA in the past was that very often HMRC were a large creditor and they were unsecured, and they did consider and vote in CVAs and accept CVAs where there was reasonable performance by the company, there was a chance of rescue of the company, and there was, no sort of abuse of taxes in the past. That has changed, but if there are low revenue debts, a CVA is still very much an option. And recently we had a successful CVA accepted in the construction sector. Now, the key advantage of a CVA is it's flexible. You can propose it over a 12-month period, a 24-month period, or the typical 60-month monthly repayments. Often within the construction sector, this can be a problem. The long-term CVA can impact tendering processes and ongoing contracts. And therefore, within construction, we would prefer a much shorter CVA and a project-based CVA. Maybe there's a development being completed and there'll be profits out of it that can be given to the creditors, or maybe a new investors coming on board. But all of them provide flexibility. Your big issue there is HMRC. The CVA does provide restructuring, going concern. The company continues going concern, and importantly, leaves the directors in control of the company. Now, the second option that has been used for years as a restructuring option is the administration. It is also impacted by the Crown preference, but to a much lesser extent. Administration is a process that was designed to protect the business and allow a business a breathing space to consider its options and give it protection from its creditors. The main goal, or the first goal or principle of it, administration, is to try and save the business in going concern, and failing that, to give a return to creditors better than liquidation, or pay some sort of dividend to creditors. Now, within the construction sector and many sectors, one of the key routes of using an administration is to form a pre-pack administration where the business is sold to the new co and the liabilities are left in the old co. This can be used to get rid of loss-making contracts, loss-making projects, and allow the profitable part of the business to continue trading. The key difference between an administration and a CVA is that the directors aren't in control. The control is with an administrator. It is a more costly process, but it does give a moratorium and allow time for a rescue plan to be processed. There is an investigation into the conduct of directors, and obviously there is the big PR issue of an administration. And in practice, a lot of administrations do ultimately lead to dissolution and liquidation of the company and a rescue in form. I suppose, whenever in April or March 2020, when all of the practicalities of COVID-19 pandemic hit, when there was the immediate availability of funding and supports, then later in 2020, and through the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, the government introduced some measures to help rescue businesses, to help give businesses options. And one of them was the introduction of the moratorium. It was a new insolvency process that was to give the company time to consider its options. An insolvency practitioner would be appointed as a monitor over the company, and the company will be given 20 days protection initially. So no creditor could bring action against the company for that 20-day period, and the company could continue to trade and meet ongoing liabilities. The 20-day period it's 20 business days. The 20 business day period can then be extended by a further 20 days. And us all in Northern Ireland, this is not currently available in Northern Ireland. It was available as a temporary measure at the start of the pandemic. When that temporary measure was made permanent, we had no government in Northern Ireland, so it is sitting there waiting to be impacted. Now, along with the moratorium, the government also introduced a restructuring plan. The restructuring plan is a court-supervised process introduced by the Act to allow a company the ability to combat the difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Initially, it's a very court-driven process, and the key takeaways or the key benefits of it, there is the ability for the court to force through a restructuring plan even when creditors won't accept it. And there is also the ability to write down other types of creditors and not just unsecured creditors which are dealt with in the other restructuring options. The court element of it would have left a lot of people believing that the cost would put it beyond the SME market and more towards the national firms, and will be used maybe more even in a retail scenario to resolve landlord issues. However, a small to medium enterprise recently had a restructuring plan approved by the court in London. Twice were issued a restructuring plan which asked HMRC to take a write down on their preferential debt as part of the restructuring plan. HMRC rejected the proposal, but the court approved the proposal because Price demonstrated that it presented a better solution than liquidation. It's the first time we've seen an SME go through this process and probably opens the door for more. And the key takeaways on it, it allows for company restructuring. There's a moratorium and alongside the moratorium, you have time to protect the business, and it aims to give a better return on liquidation. The key negatives obviously is the PR and the cost of the court-driven process, and probably the cost. We could facilitate this process through the CVA at a lot less cost if HMRC were more willing to play ball with reduction on the preferential debt. And the impact of that HMRC position has led to more insolvencies. The recent data in England and Wales are that administrations and CVAs are down and liquidation numbers are up. I have had experience in the last 6 months where we've had companies that have formulated CVAs and would give a return to revenue, not the full return, and we've seen that process not revenue and willing to work with us, and it ultimately has ended up in a liquidation to the better return for the worst creditors in the worst position. So look, liquidation, we'll talk about it a different day, but when we're thinking about liquidation, what is good practice? What do I see that I often feel firms could be in a better position if they took steps? So that I suppose what we've called it here is be ready for the unthinkable. Nobody wants to think about liquidation. Nobody wants to think about insolvency, but there's some simple housekeeping that will protect a group or a business. First of all, a lot of our entities are putting good structures. A lot of people have a whole code, a UK and Ireland, a UK and an Ireland trading company protecting them on cross-border trade. Utilize that good structure. Distribute profits, protect each company individually in it. Consider group recharges. We have often seen group companies where one company is into liquidation and there's an intercompany debtor that is chased by a liquidator. And in that situation, perhaps management charges or activities done by different companies want to charge for. So consider group recharges, regular distribution of profits. Have a holding company. If the excess profits are there, distribute them up into the holding company. Make it a regular practice so people can't overturn the distribution of them profits, profits. Secure group borrowing. So if holding companies lending money to subsidiary companies, put in place a floating charge. You might be behind the bank, or if you're lucky enough not to bank funding, you might be ahead of it. But put them charges in, it gives you a wee bit more protection. Understand the group matrix. Understand what company owes what company money. Very often we see that when people are considering intercompany or related company debt, they pull it up. But in insolvency or restructuring, that is not what is done. Each entity dealt with separately. So pooling of intercompany debts causes problems. Another issue is valuable assets, including properties, trademarks, patents. Have that in a separate company or in a holding company. Don't leave them sitting in subsidiaries that are in risky contracts or risky positions. The key one that we see in insolvency all the time is overdrawn director loan accounts coming about as a result of a dividend salary extraction policy. And the real reason, the main reason for that is that directors haven't declared dividends as they are going along. They typically visit their accountant at the end of the year and they declare a dividend at the end of the year. It is much more important to declare your dividends on a regular basis if you're on a low salary dividend extraction model. And the other point is, when you are declaring dividends, make sure you have management accounts, make sure you do the voucher, and if you can prove that the dividend was valid and that the company had the appropriate reserves. And that leads me straight into reviewing the director loan account position regularly, seeing what is owed to or from directors or shareholders. And the final point, and it's happened in the last number of months, when we sit down with a company and say, right, you're doing a CDA, you're going into liquidation here, what's the impact for the directors from a personal guarantee perspective? And more often than not, they have to check. Like, I think people should keep a register of personal guarantees to do with companies. And you need to remember that yes, you have lenders, yes, you have HP or lease companies, but you also could have opened an account with a supplier and it could be a PG there, or even more awkwardly, you could have a key staff member who's not a proprietor with a guarantee. So before I finish, I'm just going to show you a case study, an advisory case study that we recently undertook with a company. It was a very successful company in the construction sector, but the company at the time had one poor contract and they were in arbitration in England on the contract. The company had significantly strong assets and it had a good structure there and a lot of cash at bank. The nature of the contracts were that they were difficult and there was risk with their contracts. They had a current group structure, but they weren't utilizing it. So we recommended, and a lot of these points are coming out of our good practice points, utilizing the good structure. We started distributing all profits at a certain percentage up into the whole co on an annual basis. We've done it consistently. Then if there was funding needed by the subsidiary, the whole co lent it down and had taken a charge over the subsidiary. We got the client solicitor to put the charges in, and all intercompany activity was recharged. We put loan agreements in place and supported all that. It meant if one of the entities within the group went down as a result of a bad contract, it protected the rest of the group and the historical profits. We started a strategy of profit extraction, and it was consistently applied. Therefore, we could protect them from any suggestions that profit is only moved in the anticipation of difficulty. So listen, thanks very much. Hopefully that is some use to you, and we'll pass on to Richard for some legal considerations.
Thanks, Seamus. And good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for this presentation. I'm just going to close out our presentation this morning with some legal considerations, and at the end, probably look a bit more from the creditor perspective. How can you protect yourself from just the current situation that we find ourselves in? The first thing probably to look at is the order of priority. It's already been mentioned, I think, by Gary at the beginning. If you look at the list there, if you're a fixed charge holder, if you have a charge in respect of any debt owed to you, and that charge is registered against the company and the debt is lower than the amount owed, you're sitting in a pretty good position because you're number one, you're first to get payment. But in your sector, most companies are trading with other companies and fall into this category of unsecured creditors, which you see highlighted in the list there. And so you're fairly well down the pecking order. And as Gary mentioned earlier on, with the reintroduction of the Crown preference now bumping up HMRC as a creditor, that, in my view, presents more impetus for companies to do what they can to protect themselves, because as anyone who has had any experience, whether from the debtor or creditor position dealing with insolvencies, typically HMRC carry quite a lot of the debt, and now as an unsecured creditor you might find yourself in a more precarious position. And so certainly from the creditor perspective, it's important that you act quickly. The first legal consideration that I want to highlight this morning is retention of title. So retention of title, or ROT clauses, provide a form of security used by a supplier of goods as a protection against the possibility of the buyer's default or insolvency. So it is a way in which you can provide goods to a customer and have some form of protection. That means if things go south and you're owed money by that customer, you can at least get some stock back and offset that against the losses. The clauses, retention of title clauses, typically are specific to maybe one item, or quite often we see all monies clauses that are included, which, if there's a more fluid relationship with the company in terms of providing stock or products, then you can encapsulate all stock that is being provided to the customer. It's very important that these clauses are brought to the attention of the customer and that they're aware of the trading relationship. Whenever a company goes into some kind of formal insolvency, for example, administration or liquidation, if you have a retention of title clause in place, as I said, that does put you in a position where you can almost get a form of security there in which you can get your stock back and offset that against the debt owed to you. The important thing, as I've already highlighted, is that the subcontractor is aware of the terms, and so in an insolvency you will have to demonstrate that there was an ROT, a valid ROT clause in place. And it goes without saying, to ensure that you have an ROT clause in place, you know, the best thing to do is to get proper legal advice on that. In relation to retention of title, I've seen it, obviously, the benefits of that from a creditor perspective in terms of getting stock back. I've also seen some recent problems for a client of mine who had purchased some stock from a subcontractor. The subcontractor had held on to that those items temporarily, and then unfortunately the subcontractor went into an insolvency, went into administration, and as a result then the original supplier exercised their retention of title clause and ended up getting the items back from the administrator. The problem for our client then obviously is that they had paid for that item. They were expecting to receive that item, but because it hadn't left the subcontractor's premises, the retention of title clause, which was deemed to be valid, was able to be exercised by the original supplier. So we had a real problem for the client in which they paid, you know, the guts of 20 grand, and they were looking now at having to pay that again potentially because of that. So I think that's probably a warning sign, just even from the customer point of view, to make sure that if you have purchased stock, that if it is staying with the a subcontractor you purchased it from, that you are comfortable about their solvency position, to make sure that you don't have a risk there in terms of actually potentially losing the asset and having to pay for it a second time. The next consideration is contract pricing issues. Now, I will say at the outset, this is very much outside my own personal area of expertise. This is something that the construction team at Mills Selig, headed up by my partner Adrian Kerr, would regularly advise on. So I've got some insight from him to share with you today. But please go easy on me when it comes to questions, because I probably will defer any specific answers to Adrian and his expertise. All published form building contracts have mechanisms for contractors, or indeed subcontractors, to be afforded additional time and or additional money to complete work. So you will find in your normal form building contracts that there may be clauses there that means you can look at the issue of contract price and potentially renegotiate. With contracts, you should also check for the list of compensation events or relevant events matters to see if any of the events that have occurred that have caused the increased costs entitle you to more time or more money. the procurement advisory notes, when it comes to publicly funded fixed price contracts, the procurement advisory notes, known as PAN payments, may be a possibility. And I know from speaking to Adrian that CAF have been instrumental in lobbying for these payments to make sure that contractors are able to continue with the work even when they are in a publicly funded fixed price contract. What we are starting to see is a trend emerge where fewer contractors now tendering for work that is available on a fixed price basis. Now that would obviously be a sensible way. That hasn't been the way to date, and obviously that is still the preferred way that an employer would enter into a contract. But I think we will probably see, just as prices continue to fluctuate, that employers will have to look at this and see if there's other ways to address the contractual issue of fixed price. The next consideration is supplier chain issues. So we all know that we've seen increasing problems, not just in the construction sector, but throughout all sectors following Brexit and indeed the 2020 pandemic. So there's just two key steps to highlight this morning that companies should take when they're affected by this issue. The first thing is to ascertain why any supply chain issue has arisen on the project. And then secondly, check whether that reason constitutes a compensation event under the relevant contracts. So you can check your contracts, obviously, to see where you stand on that. And as I've said, if you need more specific advice on that, I would strongly recommend do not contact me, contact Adrian Kerr, and he can take you through that. The next consideration, more now from the creditor perspective, is what I do as unsecured creditor if I have a debt and I want to get paid quickly. We're still in quite a frustrating climate at the minute, I'm afraid to say, from the creditor perspective. Winding up petitions are currently not in play against other companies. As I've highlighted there, the courts have retained a restriction that was originally put in place at the outset of the pandemic, which means that presentation of company wind-up petitions by creditors cannot currently be presented. The reason being, and since we blame Stormont for a lot of things, why not blame them for this as well, but the executive collapsing there at the end of March meant that the temporary provisions that were introduced under the SEGA legislation 2020, which was mentioned earlier, have not yet been made permanent measures. And so we're in a situation where potentially companies who maybe would be faced with a winding up petition do not have the permanent measures of protection in place that other companies would currently benefit from in England and Wales and Scotland, where the SEGA permanent provisions have been brought in. And as I said, until Stormont sits again, we may be sitting here waiting for winding up petitions to be a way for creditors to pursue debts. Bankruptcy petitions are active. That obviously can't be presented against a company, but it can be presented against an individual debtor. The key change that we've seen over the last couple of years is that the court now expects that a judgment be obtained in respect of the debt. Now, that wouldn't have been the case previously. The way you would have managed a debt would be to present a statutory demand, and if the demand is not paid, then you proceed to the next stage of issuing a winding up petition or a bankruptcy petition. That no longer is the case. There are some reasons for that, in that one of the key reasons, in fact, being that the court has seen over the past number of years that really the court is used as a debt collection agency rather than a court for insolvency matters, which is the reason it is there. Bankruptcy court is to deal with insolvent companies and individuals, and so there has been, it's fair to say, maybe a bit of abuse used there in terms of creditors who don't really, who maybe there may be a dispute in respect of their debt, but are deciding to go down this route because it's quicker and more efficient and more of a threat. And so that's not going to happen now, because companies and individuals must now go ahead and get a judgment before they can present a bankruptcy petition. So whilst winding up petitions can't be presented at the minute, if you are in a situation as a creditor, there's a debt there and you want to maximize your chances of getting a return on that debt, then you may want to consider going to get a judgment now at this stage, so that you're ready to go whenever winding up petitions are back in play. It's hard to predict when exactly that would happen. If the executive is back in at the end of October, then it could be shortly thereafter, or we could be looking into the new year before winding up petitions are back in play. So to finish off on my presentation, just some of the key considerations for creditors. So some of these I've mentioned, but worth re-emphasizing. The first thing, obviously, is to seek to limit exposure where possible when debt is unsecured. So, you know, your debtor days, making sure that, you know, if you are aware of a debtor company that you're dealing with, that you're not overly exposed, that your exposure is as low as it can be. Obviously, that comes informally through just communication, making sure that you're comfortable. And if you do hear any rumors or any concerns about that company, that you investigate that and just make sure your credit control is as tight as it can be on that. As mentioned previously, you can obtain a court judgment against debtor, which puts you in a position to present a winding up petition whenever those come back into the arena. Again, some clients often ask, you know, what's the point in getting in getting a judgment, or indeed presenting a wind up petition, if there's little chance of being paid, if indeed you are an unsecured creditor and you're well down the list of priorities? Well, that is obviously something you need to consider. What I would say to that is, you know, in some cases we have found that whenever a unsecured creditor acts quickly, they may have more of a chance of getting some sort of recovery rather than find themselves in with the wider body of unsecured creditors, because they have acted and put the debtor company under a bit more pressure. They actually have more chance of getting some kind of return. It's important to review supply contracts to ensure that you are as protected as you can be. So I mentioned earlier about retention of title clauses, things like that can be put in that actually give you more protection and reduce the risk of loss if a debtor that you're dealing with goes into some form of insolvency procedure. Fourthly, then, gives serious consideration to a compromise settlement when dealing with a distressed company. Now, I know that can always feel very bitter and difficult, not an easy pill to swallow whenever you're owed a significant amount of money. But as I said, if you find yourself in that position where you are unsecured for your debt, you're looking at potentially getting nothing back, then, you know, do what you can to get something half sensible. And obviously you can get some advice from, you know, accountants and lawyers on that to see whether or not that seems like a sensible proposal. And then finally, it's important to be aware of potential challenge for any payments you've received after insolvency. So there are rules within the insolvency rules that provide for this, in that if a payment is made immediately preceding an insolvency, it may potentially be challenged. If that's made within the first 6 months, it almost certainly will be challenged. If it's made within the first 2 years, it may even be challenged. That's in that time frame. And so it is important that if you do receive a payment and the company then subsequently goes into liquidation or administration, that you're able to show that you put a significant amount of pressure on that company to make the payment, and it wasn't a situation whereby you were being preferred to other unsecured creditors. Because if it looks like a preference has been made and you have been preferred against the wider body of unsecured creditors, then that payment could be challenged, and the liquidator or administrator may pursue your company to try and recover that payment. So in summary then, I think what I would say is that during the global pandemic, we have seen various support measures that have been in place to assist businesses, and this has resulted in a significant decrease of activity in restructuring and insolvency market. We've seen really little or no activity for the last couple of years. The economic challenges that now extend beyond the effects of the pandemic, with businesses facing soaring costs, for example, energy, labor, materials, and of course rising interest rates, is just the landscape that we're in. And we can and should expect to see an increase in corporate insolvencies over the next year. So goes without saying that, you know, and again, as Gary and Seamas have tried to point out during this presentation, being proactive, whether you're from a creditor or debtor perspective, is the most important thing that you can do. Sometimes we don't want to think that there are storms or problems around the corner. We would like to continue on with the fun parts of business, but there are things that you can do from both debtor and creditor perspective to make sure that the business is successful, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And so getting advice on any of these matters is the best thing that we could probably recommend you do. So that's all I have to say. I think there's just going to be some concluding comments, and then we are going to look at maybe some of the questions and spend the rest of our time in a bit of discussion around that. Thank you.
Great. Richard, thanks very much. And Seamus and Gary as well, thank you. And if you guys want to come back on screen, we do have a number of questions which have come in through that. What I would say is, anybody on the call, if you haven't asked a question as CEF members, you know you have access to both Mills Selig and FPM, who will give you some advice. And actually, I know actively both of you are working on behalf of members in more detail in a number of cases. So that obviously is always appreciated. I'll take the questions in the order I receive them, which probably means I'm looking to FPM for the first couple of questions. How are CBILS and bounce back loans addressed in corporate restructuring, and what is their attitude to helping businesses?
CBILS and bounce back loans, we've seen them both from an insolvency and a restructuring perspective. The most recent case was a CBA where the CBILS loan was provided, and the CBILS they stayed outside the voting and allowed the CBA to be accepted and would take their dividend from the CBA. Now, it's worth remembering the impact of the CBILS and bounce back loans. Bounce back loans were to have no personal guarantees and unsecured. CBILS loans up to 250,000 were to have no guarantees and but may have been subject to existing security. So very much we're seeing at the start of the pandemic, and maybe the early bounce back or CBILS loans that were being mentioned in restructuring processes, the banks were unsure of what to do. But I think the guidance to the banks from the British Banking Authority is to do what they would normally do as a bank in that situation. So if a CVA or an administration is happening, they're to vote or they're to consider it in the normal way. I think it's worth mentioning when we mention bounce back and CBILS loans away from restructuring and into insolvency, we're all aware of the horror stories in the news, but basically anybody who faces an administration or liquidation, they will investigate the company and how they obtained the loan, and were they in insolvency before December 19, and also were they able to obtain the loan because it was self-certification. The second point they will look at is the usage of the bounce back loan or the CBILS loan, and that can lead to two issues: one, director disqualification issues, and two, the usual insolvency remedies are there to recover. So I know it's maybe, hopefully I'm speaking, there's no issues like this out there, but it is very much in the news. But in respect of restructuring activities, we've certainly seen the bank adopting a usual approach, and we have seen them allow arrangements and settlements to go ahead, albeit the guidance is given that they should act as normal.
Okay, thanks for that, James. Next question, I can totally see where this question is coming from in terms of delivering for clients. Well, what is the impact of formal restructuring options on ongoing contracts?
Hi, Richard. I think if you're forming a restructuring market, I was doing CBA and administrations in the last number of years in the construction sector. First of all, in an insolvency impact, the first thing you need to do, if you're going to go down the route of a CBA or an administration with a pre-pack, the contracts will have an insolvency clause. So the likelihood, whilst they're restructuring, they are insolvency events. So you will have to speak to the customer and agree, look, if we pre-pack this business, if we go into a CBA, are you going to allow the contract to continue? And look, Richard might be something more legal, coming from a commercial aspect, but you need to talk to them. It is an event of default. And, in insolvency, very often in a construction company, where they have ongoing contracts and their own debtors and work in progress from them contracts, very often that money owed becomes a creditor, because if the contract's not continued, they have to get a new contractor, and then the company's liable for the increased costs. The most successful companies are restructuring in the construction sector, we have been part of, is where the contracts were able to be continued and able to be completed. But we also have to remember the problem of public procurement, and that prevents the difficulty. And finally, and I mentioned it earlier in the CBAs, going into a CBA and continuing ongoing contracts is one thing, but if you're in a 5-year CBA and it's a event of insolvency, you ain't tendering for any more contracts with the government, and you might have an issue from supply chain because a principal contractor may not want to risk using a subcontractor that's already in insolvency or in financial difficulty.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points, Seamus. Now, I know from sitting on procurement board, certainly Department of Finance are looking at very much strengthening the financial thresholds for companies entering into public sector contracts, and it does create some issues. And Richard, I'm sure you and Adrian would see that as well. This one might be for yourself, Richard. Are there any circumstances in which the directors of the company can be personally liable for the debts of the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. It very much depends on the conduct of the directors. So, the director duties are voluminous. Certainly not something we could go into all the detail this morning, but that is something that every director should be aware of. Whenever they have breached any fiduciary duty that they owe to the company, then there is a risk that they could be in some way personally responsible, and the corporate veil that's there could be lifted. When it comes to the debts of the company, I mean, typically it would have to be, pretty severe. I mean, we're talking the F word here, fraud or something pretty serious like that might be an issue. Data, I did get some inquiries over the past couple of years where, relevant to the loans that were mentioned there, where loans have been taken out for the company and it hasn't been the company that has benefited fully from that loan. And speaking to directors of the company now looking at potential insolvency, and the warning has to be there. Well, look, if that money hasn't been used hasn't been used for the company, then there is a risk, obviously, that if you ever did get the benefit of that, we'll have to pay it back. So there are some circumstances where financially there could be a risk for the director, but the main thing to be aware of are just all those kind of fiduciary duties. And when it comes to insolvency, I'm sure Seamus and Gary will agree with me on this point. The important thing for a director is that they do act quickly, that they're seen to, if it's on the debtor side, that they're seen to be acting proactively and trying to make sure that they've got the creditor's interests at heart. Sitting back, burying our heads in the sand, that's not going to work out well for the director, and there may be other implications, non-financial implications like disqualification and stuff like that you might be looking at post-insolvency, which creates obviously problems in terms of future directorships that you may want to hold.
think, Richard, too, just on that, sorry, the recent legislation brought in at HMRC, if a director within a period, I can't remember the period, I think it was 2 or 3 years, has a second insolvency, and both insolvencies, but predominantly for revenue debt, they can be held liable for the personally liable for the debts of the second insolvency. And I haven't seen much of that in practice, probably because of the lack of insolvency the last couple of years. But that is something that has been brought in for serial liquidations.
Yes.
Personal exposure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Thanks for that. Just anybody on the call, if you do have a final question you want to throw in, I've only got one more on my screen, so do feel free to lob in. Maybe it's a fairly general question, but it obviously goes deeper. Is there any point in a creditor pursuing a debt if the debtor appears already to be insolvent? I guess that's a financial and a legal question, so I'll throw that open. Who wants to take it?
Well, I'll start, sure. I mean, from a legal perspective, like I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, I think, it may not look too positive, but again, sometimes I have seen that, where creditors put a bit more pressure on formally, and it has produced a better return, in terms of getting something back. That being said, if it looks like there's absolutely nothing there and you've done a bit of research on that and you're comfortable that there is, then I have to say the only person that would benefit is probably me, because you'll just be paying legal costs. You'll not get a recovery on that. But I mean, that's something that has to be looked at, probably, Mark, on a case by case basis, because, and Seamas, Gary and I, because we're familiar and working in this sector, often a debtor will present themselves as being in a very weak position if it means that they have to pay back money. So there may be other things that can be looked at. There may be some pressure points that are worth considering, and again, that's where probably the legal advice is really important, and also the accountancy advice in terms of getting an expert like Seamas or Gary to actually look at what the debtor position is and analyze that before you make a decision. But if there's nothing there, then yes, there's probably little point in pursuing it.
I think it's, Mark, you're trying to establish the difference between can't pay and won't pay.
Yeah.
I know of a number of situations that we've come across as maybe as liquidators collecting a book of debts. And I know on occasion we have spent money and issued winding applications and it's worked for us, but it's trying to find out, is the issue they don't want to pay or they can't pay. And it's key to the decision.
Key difference. Listen, guys, that's fantastic. I really appreciate your time today. Richard, Seamas, Gary, fantastic knowledge there. I know you all feel you've just scratched the surface of that, but there's much more we could do. So again, the important message for everybody on the call is do get in contact. Mills Selig, FPM, be happy to hear from you. We've recorded this session, so in the next couple of days, you'll get a link to that. That'll be up on our YouTube, and we'll share that with you. Hope you find it useful. Again, many thanks, FPM. Mills Selig is always there for the industry, showing your knowledge. Appreciate the input today. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call, and hope you find it useful. Thanks very much indeed. Take care.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.